Good afternoon, West in the world. It is Tuesday, March the 1st, and in class in recent days, we have been introducing the themes of late 18th and 19th century revolutions, starting with the Industrial Revolution and then continuing through the period of the Atlantic revolutions. I didn't get a separate video made on the Industrial Revolution last week, but I don't really want to try to tackle that here as well. I want to focus instead on the era of the Atlantic revolutions, and perhaps use it as an opportunity to foreshadow Thursday's discussion on inhuman traffic. And then at the end of this video, I am going to make a few points about pet peeves of mine in this paper, things that you might want to avoid. So let's hone in just for a minute on this idea of the Atlantic revolutions and what kinds of issues have sort of unified them. The Atlantic revolutions, the American War for Independence, the French Revolution, and then, of course, the Latin American revolutions from Haiti to South and Central America, as a sort of combined sequence of events unfold between the 1770s and about the 1820s. And they fundamentally sort of reorder much of the, at least Atlantic world in that time period. We talked today about about the idea of what was making people angry, right? What kinds of things had upset them that led to this sort of revolutionary period. In the American case, we talked about the issues of taxation, their perception of how government ought to be functioning in their relationship with Britain. In the French case, it was also an issue of taxation, as well as sort of built-up resentment from years of privilege enjoyed by the nobility. And then, of course, in the case of Haiti, the specific issue was this sort of the long-lasting institution of slavery, and the awareness on the part of those slaves that they existed within the context of a state that had abolished slavery, but that it had not extended that right to them as well, and that they began to rise up against that sort of ordering of their world. The issues that sort of weave through all of these, at the beginning of this section, we introduce as being about sort of that notion of citizenship versus subjecthood. Citizens as people who have rights, who want to participate in the making of their state and in its structures. And that theme, of course, can be found in all of these. The demands for liberty, the idea of equality as a crucial idea that's articulated in documents like the American Declaration of Independence, right? That all men are created equal, that they are endowed with these inalienable rights. The very motto of the French Revolution called for liberty, equality, fraternity, or brotherhood. Of course, the situation in Haiti also sort of points in this same direction towards raising more clearly what equality ought to look like in these circumstances, and set in motion many of the events, of course, that trickle into inhuman traffic. And so all of these things we've said are in many ways a byproduct of the Enlightenment age, where these expectations, new expectations of what government should look like, are beginning to unfold. And as you are writing your responses to your own reading of Inhuman Traffic, I hope that you keep that in mind. You may also, of course, find it useful to think a little bit about the Industrial Revolution, and we'll come back around to that after we discuss the book. But of course, as Britain is working its way through this abolitionist period, we need to be mindful of the fact that it is also an industrial power, that it is also facing these new developments in its economy and asking ourselves, how does that sort of affect their relationship with slave trading nations in West Africa and elsewhere? All of this is going to be sort of the center point of our discussion, because of course the issues of the abolition of the slave trade speak very clearly to all of these attitudes and the values that lie behind them. How can a society like America in the 18th century, that claimed to value equality of all men and the notion of inalienable rights, how did it reconcile itself to an institution like slavery? So, all of that, I hope, will be coming up for you and be in your mind as you write your papers. We'll also be talking about it in class on Thursday. But just before I go, I did want to mention a few things that tend to happen in these papers and that you might want to be extra cautious about as you're writing. So, first of all, one of the temptations that students find themselves leaning to is the temptation to simply retell the story. That is, to explain sort of blow by blow the events of the book. Don't do that. Assume that I have read the book, that I understand the basic plot line. Instead, make sure that whatever you write is focused on answering the questions in the prompt. You only have 800 words for this, so make sure that you use them efficiently. Secondly, avoid the temptation, the ever real temptation, of making exaggerated claims. There's a decided tendency to want to say that so-and-so changed their world, or to make sort of big dramatic statements to try to prove that this subject somehow matters. And obviously, in the big picture sense, the movement toward the abolition of the slave trade and then the institution of slavery did fundamentally change the world in the long run. But just as you write about the individuals in the story, and you think about sort of their choices and decisions, just make sure that you don't sort of exaggerate their particular influence, or that you don't make the claim that this Nirse incident itself was the pivotal moment. It exemplifies the moment, but it isn't necessarily the pivot on which things turn. Number 3, this book contains within it a lot of narrative about peoples of African descent, and some of them do end up in the Americas. It is not, however, often going to be the case that you are going to want to use the term African American. And this happens with surprising frequency in student papers. I think it's just almost a force of habit. But if you do find yourself writing about peoples of African descent, make sure that you describe them accurately, and that you don't characterize them as African Americans if, as would most likely be the case, they are not. Lastly, just be careful not to refer to this book as a graphic novel. Students often do this, but a novel implies a work of fiction, and that's not what's happening here. It is a story, but it is not necessarily, it wouldn't really be appropriate to refer to it as a novel. It is not a work of fiction. It claims to be a graphic history, a historic account of things that really did happen. We'll talk a little bit about why you may or may not agree with that characterization, but that's the claim. So, if you can keep those things in mind, I think you'll find yourself in good shape. Looking forward to reading your papers and talking with you about the book on Thursday.